She returned near dawn, heels clicking, a bag slung over her shoulder. I didn't ask where she'd been. The truth was already clear. Then, one day, she appeared in front of me in a hospital room, pale, trembling, confessing a life I'd never known she led. September 2014, Denver, Colorado. The city was already quieting down, streetlights casting long shadows on empty sidewalks. While in my apartment in Capitol Hill, the kitchen light stayed on. I sat at the table, staring at the clock, feeling the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock as if the apartment itself was waiting with me. I was 32, an aerospace engineer, married for 5 years, together with her for nearly a decade. I had built a life of routines, late nights at the office, careful schedules, and quiet weekends, and I thought I understood it all. My wife's career in corporate consulting had taken off in ways I hadn't anticipated. Trips that were once occasional became frequent, late meetings stretched into the night, and flights disrupted what had been predictable patterns. Over the months, the small gestures that had once meant presence and connection had faded. The way she used to laugh in the kitchen, the coffee she would make me before work, the easy comfort of her presence. That night, she returned near dawn, her figure appearing in the doorway, silent, a bag slung over her shoulder, heels clicking softly against the hardwood. There was no warmth in her arrival, no shared look or acknowledgement beyond the brief nod toward me. The apartment had grown colder over time, the space between us widening in invisible increments, measured in the hours of absence and the unanswered questions that had accumulated. I wanted to ask where she had been, to understand why the phone remained unanswered for hours. But even before the words formed, I knew any attempt would be met with defensiveness, with dismissal. Instead of anger, I felt a quiet collapse inside, a subtle thread snapping in the back of my mind. It was not dramatic, not a storm of emotion, but a slow recognition that trust had already died, months before this moment, leaving only the habit of coexisting under the same roof. I noticed the way she moved past me, how she carried herself as if the apartment and I were obstacles to be navigated around, and I realized that any expectation I had held was now obsolete. The realization was sharp but silent. Nothing I said or felt could bridge the gap that had been silently widening for years. I remained at the table, the first gray light of morning spilling across the countertop, and in that quiet, I understood that the life I had thought we shared had already ended, and the night itself had merely marked the point of acknowledgement. At dawn, I moved through the apartment with deliberate calm, the city outside beginning to stir with the first sounds of morning traffic and distant sirens. I packed methodically, folding clothes into a duffel bag, organizing documents and my work laptop, as if preparing for a business trip rather than leaving a marriage. Every action was measured, precise, and stripped of drama. I avoided leaving a note, avoided any gesture that could be misinterpreted as explanation or apology, because I understood that words would not repair the breach that had grown over months. The walls, once familiar and comforting, now felt like boundaries I could not cross, a space I could no longer inhabit with shared trust. I slipped out quietly, locking the door behind me, the soft click echoing in the empty hallway. The air outside carried the chill of early September, crisp against my skin, and the streets were beginning to fill with morning commuters. I carried only what I needed, leaving behind everything that had become a symbol of routine, of proximity that no longer existed. My first stop was a friend's apartment, an old roommate from university who had once offered me refuge in a moment of uncertainty. His guest room became a temporary shelter, the quiet of his space starkly contrasting with the tension I had left behind. In the first days, I moved between work and the guest room, each step deliberate, avoiding reflection on the past or the questions that would have demanded answers I no longer wanted. I initiated the divorce proceedings with the same precision I applied to my engineering projects. Methodical, unemotional, deliberate. Every form filed, every meeting scheduled, every phone call placed reinforced the internal truth I had arrived at. Knowing the exact details of her actions would not restore anything, would not mend the invisible fracture that had grown between us. The fact that she had lived another life in parallel, a life I had only glimpsed in fleeting absences and evasive responses, was sufficient. There were no confrontations, no scenes, no arguments to punctuate the departure. That absence of spectacle became its own statement, the quiet confirmation of a choice fully formed. It was not born of cowardice but of recognition. The rupture had been long in the making, and performing pain or seeking vindication would not alter the course. Each passing hour reinforced the inevitability of distance, the necessity of severing the habitual ties, and the clarity that leaving without dramatics was both an act of self-preservation and finality. In the silence of that dawn, walking away into a city beginning to awaken, I realized that the decision was absolute, and the first steps of freedom were measured not in emotion, but in the cold precision of action. From 2015 to 2018, my life settled into a rhythm that was at once exhausting and stabilizing. I moved into a modest apartment within walking distance of the Aerospace Research Center, a space that was intentionally sparse, stripped of reminders of the life I had left behind. Each morning, I woke early, brewed coffee in silence, and walked through the streets still carrying the quiet residue of the divorce. My days were consumed by projects that demanded focus and precision. I volunteered for additional shifts, took on responsibilities that others avoided, and became deeply involved in the launch of new satellite programs, learning to measure time and success in data points and orbital calculations rather than human connection. Weekends were rituals of isolation and self-maintenance. I ran through the city parks while the air was still cool, the streets almost empty, timing my routes and breathing to a strict cadence. Grocery shopping, laundry, cleaning, and organizing became meditative acts, exercises in control in a world that had so abruptly stripped me of it. Nights were quiet, filled with reading technical reports, analyzing flight data, or watching the city's skyline from the small balcony of the apartment, lights twinkling like distant stars. There was a sense of purpose in the solitude, a rhythm that required no negotiation, no compromise, no expectation beyond the tasks I chose to take on. The divorce had been finalized quickly, cleanly, without dispute over property or assets. The formal separation was almost antiseptic, a document stamped and signed, yet it carried the weight of years of suppressed tension and unspoken disappointments. I discovered through mutual acquaintances that she had entered a new relationship almost immediately after our separation, her new partner connected to her work on international projects. The knowledge did not ignite jealousy or anger. It simply confirmed that my decision to leave had been correct. In those years, I observed her life from a distance, receiving fragments of information like data points in a larger study, each piece reinforcing the necessity of my absence. Emotionally, I built walls that were not coldness but protection. Friendships were limited to a few reliable contacts. Professional relationships cultivated with care. Personal interactions minimized. I existed in a world defined by work, routine, and self-sufficiency, discovering that stability did not require closeness or intimacy. Gradually, the space left by absence became a canvas for rebuilding, a methodical reconstruction of life on terms I controlled entirely. There were moments of quiet reflection, late at night, when I considered what had been lost, but these were fleeting, replaced by the discipline of preparation, planning, and execution. By the end of 2018, I had established a life that was unremarkable to outsiders but profoundly my own, a life in which the past existed only as a distant coordinate, important only insofar as it shaped the trajectory I now maintained. Spring 2021, Austin, Texas. I had been transferred to a new research center, a sprawling campus filled with the quiet hum of laboratories and office buildings, each corridor precise and deliberately designed. It was an ordinary day, one of many that followed the same pattern: review reports, run simulations, meet with colleagues, check equipment, log results. My steps carried me through the clinical wing of the campus, where employees underwent routine health assessments before long-term field assignments. I entered the small examination room with a sense of procedural calm, scanning the schedule for the next patient. One name, familiar in shape and spelling, stopped me mid-motion, triggering an almost imperceptible tightening in my chest. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, fluorescent lights casting a neutral glow over metal tables and mounted medical devices. I moved through the motions I had performed countless times before, adjusting gloves, checking the forms, preparing the instruments, while my mind briefly paused on the memory of a life that had once filled a different space in the same body. Then she appeared, sitting on the examination table, frozen in posture, her face pale beneath the artificial light, her eyes widening as they landed on me. 7 years had passed, and yet there was an echo of recognition, a memory of presence that lingered in the air between us. She was the same, and not the same. Lines of tension traced her face, subtle signs of fatigue and years of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. Her hair, posture, the set of her hands, all carried traces of time and experience that had altered her, yet the essence that I remembered persisted, sharp and undeniable. I maintained the professional mask I had perfected over the years, my movements deliberate, measured, almost mechanical. Every adjustment of the blood pressure cuff, every check of forms, every placement of instruments was precise, rehearsed, designed to hold the encounter within the boundaries of procedure and propriety. Inside, my mind flickered over old corridors, old apartments, moments of quiet despair and realization. But externally, nothing shifted. I was calm, neutral, controlled, aware that any deviation could destabilize the balance I had carefully maintained over the years. The silence between us stretched, an invisible measure of distance and proximity at once. I recognized the faint tremor in her hands, the subtle hesitation in the tilt of her head. But I did not respond to it with emotion. I registered it, cataloged it, and continued the examination, moving with the detachment of someone performing an established routine while internally noting the incongruities, the small signs of a life reshaped. The past had returned, not as a storm, not as a confrontation, but as a quiet presence that demanded acknowledgement without participation. For those minutes, the room became a threshold, a space suspended between what had been and what had become, where recognition existed in silence, and where the continuity of my life remained intact despite the ghost of memory standing before me. After the formal procedures were complete, she lingered, her presence in the room shifting from patient to something unspoken, a quiet attempt to bridge a gap that had long been sealed. Her movements were hesitant, measured, as though rehearsed in private hours, and the weight she carried was evident in the subtle slump of her shoulders and the way her eyes avoided mine, tracing the floor instead of meeting it. She spoke in fragments, not with the urgency of confession, but with the precision of a report, admitting that during those years she had lived another life in parallel, that fear and self-preservation had hardened her, transforming her into someone distant, cold, and occasionally cruel. I listened without interruption, my posture neutral, hands resting on the edge of the counter, fingers loosely interlaced. There was no anger, no sharp response. The words were catalogued, processed like data from a file long closed, their emotional charge diminished by the years and the distance I had built around myself. Every admission she made was absorbed into a mental ledger, a record of fact rather than grievance. The past no longer demanded intervention, no longer sought validation or retribution. I did not rise to the occasion of providing absolution, did not offer reassurance or solace, because that role had never been mine to take, and I no longer felt compelled to occupy it. The room itself seemed smaller, compressed by the weight of memory and acknowledgement, yet it remained neutral territory, a space defined by routine rather than sentiment. I noted the subtle changes in her expression, the fatigue etched along the lines of her face, the hesitation in her movements, and I registered them clinically, without attachment. The confession was her reckoning, a personal audit she imposed upon herself, and I allowed it to unfold without participation, observing as one might observe the conclusion of a distant event. Internally, I was anchored in a place far removed from the past she described. The point of rupture, that quiet, irrevocable decision in Denver years ago, had already determined the trajectory of my life. That moment had closed the door on expectation, on reliance, on the influence she once held. Listening now, I was aware of the continuity of my own path, the stability I had built in the intervening years, and the absence of need to rewrite or reinterpret history. Her attempt to settle accounts, to make peace with her own conscience, passed through me without altering the equilibrium I had achieved. It was a transaction of acknowledgement, not reconciliation, and I met it with the calm clarity of someone who had long since stopped responding to the shadows of a life left behind. By the summer of 2022, my life in Austin had settled into a steady, predictable rhythm that I had come to rely on. The apartment was small but orderly, each item in its place, a reflection of the life I had painstakingly reconstructed over the years. Work occupied the bulk of my hours, but it was a work I found meaningful, a balance of challenge and competence that left little space for unnecessary distraction. Outside of work, I maintained a small circle of friends, people whose presence was quiet, consistent, and unintrusive. There were no demands beyond simple companionship, no pressure to perform or to justify my past, only the steady, measured rhythms of shared routines and occasional conversations. I had begun a relationship with a woman outside of my professional sphere, one defined by the slow unfolding of trust rather than immediate intensity or urgency. The connection was gentle, unhurried, and deliberately constructed without the entanglements of expectation or projection. We spent time together deliberately and sparsely, choosing presence over performance, conversation over explanation. Her life was fully her own, as was mine, and in that separation of boundaries I found comfort, a reaffirmation that connection need not dissolve individuality. The encounter with my past, the unexpected meeting with her in the clinical wing, had not reopened wounds or shifted the balance I had established. Instead, it confirmed the distance that time and careful self-direction had created. I recognized the contours of my former self in the brief flash of memory, but I also recognized how far I had moved, how distinctly I had separated who I had been from who I had become. There was no lingering resentment, no need to justify, no desire to revisit the missteps and betrayals of years past. The past existed only as a record, a cataloged archive of experience from which I had extracted lessons and closure, nothing more. Life now moved forward on its own terms, a quiet momentum built on deliberate choices, rather than reaction or recompense. I woke each morning with the certainty that my hours would be my own, filled with work I found purpose in, walks with my dog through the quiet neighborhoods, shared meals, and small routines that marked time without demanding drama. There was no urgency, no unfinished business pressing on my attention, only the steady, intentional maintenance of stability. The sense of peace I carried was not born from triumph or revenge, but from the measured accumulation of control over my own life and choices. Each decision, from the work I undertook to the people I allowed into my space, reinforced a framework of internal stability. I had moved beyond the compulsion to fix or to punish, beyond the need to revisit or reconcile the past. What remained was a quiet assurance that I had arrived at a point of equilibrium, a vantage from which I could observe the world without expectation or fear. The result was not closure imposed externally, but a sustainable inner calm, a sense that my life was fully mine, shaped not by the actions of others, but by the deliberate, patient work of reclaiming agency and cultivating resilience. In that space, the past no longer had power. The present was steady and tangible, and the future, though uncertain, could be approached with measured confidence, free from the shadows that had once defined me.